I'm Matt. Disculpa, no, me falta portugués, so this talk is going to be in English. I am, as you've just heard, I'm a graduate student at the University of Michigan. I'm advised by Alex Halderman, and I'm here to talk to you today about our experience last year with the 2016 US presidential election and subsequent recounts. So just to kind of give you some context and refresh your memory a little bit, last year we had an election between these two candidates. We had Donald Trump here on the left and Hillary Clinton here on the right. And as I'm sure you all know by now, what happened? Donald Trump won the election. But it wasn't always this obvious. Going into the election, many people expected Hillary Clinton to win. This is 538, which is a well-known election blog in the United States that does poll aggregation and predicts elections. And to give you an idea of how good they are, in the last two elections, 2008 and 2012, they projected almost every single state correctly. So they're generally very, very accurate. So you can see here that they're giving Hillary Clinton a 71% chance of winning. And they weren't alone in this. You have the New York Times here giving Hillary an 85% chance. You have the Princeton Election Consortium, which is basically run by this guy, Sam Wong, who was giving Hillary a 99% chance of winning. And Sam was so confident that he said, if Trump wins more than 240 electoral votes, he will eat a bug. So in general, the feeling was that Hillary was going to win this race. As you can see, literally every pollster that we know of was calling it for her. Of course, by now, I'm sure you know that that's not all what happened, and what actually happened was this, where essentially, in a thing that surprised everyone, including Sam Wong, who, God bless him, ate the bug on national television, Trump won. So, you know, these are the actual results here. You can see Donald Trump won our electoral votes, and I'll explain what electoral votes are in a second, so don't worry too much about that. But despite that, Hillary Clinton won the popular vote. She won, you know, the margin was 3 million more votes for Clinton than Trump, which we have this crazy system where this can happen where everybody votes for one candidate, but the other candidate still wins. And this is a fairly close race. Despite what Trump has continued to say since he was elected, his electoral victory was really, you know, not one of the better ones. In fact, it ranks 46th out of all of the presidential elections that we've ever had. So this was a very close race, and it was an unexpected result. So what happened? Either there's one explanation that the polls were systematically wrong, and this is sort of what Nate Silver, who runs 538, and Sam Wong have claimed, that, you know, the results were within the margins of errors of the polls, and the polls were just wrong. Or the elections were hacked. And this seems to be the theory that Donald Trump himself has continued to try and put out into the world, that, you know, the election was rigged, that, you know, the election results were not valid. So, you know, this is probably unlikely. It seems completely reasonable to me, and at the time it did too, that the polls were just wrong. So what's going on? You know, is what Donald Trump here claiming actually feasible? Is this even possible? And if it is, how do we find out? So this is kind of what we wanted to do last year around this time. So to give you a brief overview of American elections and why all of this is so crazy, you know, first of all, we have a massive scale. I'm sure, you know, here in Brazil, you're a very large country, so you kind of understand that as well. And our elections are highly distributed, unlike Brazil. So every state, county, small town gets to decide how they vote. These elections are really complex. We have really long ballots with lots of different races on them. They're sensitive to latency, where we really need results on election night. And, you know, again, just some statistics for you over here. We have 200 million registered voters, 187,000 different places where people cast their votes, and 52 different models of voting machine here. Unlike Brazil, where you just have the one, we have a lot of different ones. This is a map of the US, including technology that was used in 2016 from verified voting. And you can see here, you know, we have basically any possible combination of technology you can imagine, we have it. In the Pacific Northwest here, you have postal voting. In Georgia and South Carolina here, you have DRE, paperless DREs, which is just like what you use here in Brazil. In states like Michigan and New York, it's only paper ballots that are optically scanned. And then you have places like Nevada or Texas or Florida or Tennessee where it's some mixture of these things. And again, to show you the complexity here, this is one US state, and these are all the different counties in that state. And you can see not even the counties can agree on what kind of technology to use. You have some that use paperless DREs, some that only use paper, and so on and so forth. So the point here is that our election technology is very diverse and very complex. I mentioned that our ballots are really complex. This is a ballot from the city of Dallas, Texas last year. And as you can see, this is a lot of text. You have to read all this stuff before you get down to here where you get to actually vote for someone. And you can imagine that this is pretty exhausting for the voter. But this is just page 1, and you can see all of these races here, and there are 8 pages like this. So it's incredibly complicated for anybody to vote, let alone if a technology were to change one of these races on one of these pages, a voter's not going to notice that. As I mentioned, we have many different kinds of voting machines, but really they break down into 2 kind of categories. You have optical scan here, which is where you fill out you bubble in your choice on a ballot like is shown here, and then you feed it into a scanner. Sometimes these are just counted by hand. And then you have DREs, which are very similar to what are used in Brazil. And sometimes they produce a paper tape, and sometimes they don't. This is an example of one of the DREs that is used in the United States. This is the Diebold AccuVote TS, which has been in use since 2003 and is still currently being used in the state of Georgia in the US. My advisor, when he was a grad student 10 years ago, took it upon himself to take one of these machines apart and see how vulnerable is it, how secure are these systems. So you can see, they broke the machine open. They got to look at the motherboard. Their EEPROM chips and all kinds of other fun things inside of this. And what they discovered is that these machines were not secure at all. They repeat the same cryptographic key across all of the machines. The way the bootloader is done, it'll run any software you give it. And so what they realized with this is that you can put these machines are all programmed with these memory cards that get inserted. And so if you put a virus on that memory card and then stick it in the machine then becomes infected with that virus. And moreover, if you take another memory card that hasn't been infected and you plug it into this machine, it also gets infected with the virus. And so in this way you can propagate a virus across many, many different voting machines, all without being connected to the internet. And to give you an idea of what this virus might look like, here you see 2 choices for, this is a spoof ballot where you have, clearly the voter here is voting for George Washington on the top and not Benedict Arnold. But what this virus lets you do is it tricks the machine into saying, hey voter, you voted for George Washington, but then at the end of the election, you can see that Benedict Arnold has won. And this is a trial election where 5 votes were cast and all of them were cast for George Washington. And this malware is so easy to build that you even have time to build nice user interfaces for it. It's really not that difficult. So you can see here, there's a nice sliding scale here where you can choose how much you want your candidate to win by. That's just how insecure these machines are. But that's just one voting machine. How about the rest of them? I said we use 52 and I've only talked about 1. Well, every single voting machine that has ever been used in the United States and studied has been shown to be vulnerable. You have your DREs like this, the AccuVote TS, which is the successor to the AccuVote TS. You have the Sequoia ABC Edge here, which is so easily breakable that you can teach it to play Pac-Man, which you can see here. And then you have these optical scan machines too, all of which have been broken before. So in short, none of our voting machines, at least that have been looked at, are particularly secure. And as I mentioned, every single one of them that has ever been looked at has been found to be incredibly vulnerable. So could you hack an election? We have these vulnerable voting machines, but there are all these different kinds. The counties and the cities and the states all have different technology. Maybe it's not feasible to sort of swing enough votes where you can actually affect the outcome. You sort of have these 3 plausible scenarios if you wanted to hack an election. One being you alter the results on election night to be something completely out of left field that no one understands, and in this way you can undermine the credibility of the election. Obviously something went wrong. You can deny service, you can create long lines of polling places, you can shut down voting machines, you can cut the power, you can do many different kinds of things that just prevents people from voting. And you can cause political interference. You can, if you're a foreign government, you can undertake a disinformation campaign about one of the candidates to discredit them. And the scary thing about all of these is that we've seen all three of these play out in reality. In 2014 in Ukraine, Russia did the top two here. They altered the election night result, and they also DOSed the counting servers. And then, as you might know, in 2016, Russia was running a disinformation campaign against Hillary Clinton. So all three of these hacking scenarios have happened, and some of them even in the election that we were looking at. But let's say you actually wanted to flip votes. How are you going to do that? There are sort of three main challenges that you have here. One, as I mentioned, you have all this different technology. The machines aren't connected to the internet. And 70% of US votes have some kind of paper record that you could go to in case something went wrong with the machines and count and double check. So how do you, these seem like pretty staunch challenges. How are you going to overcome them? Well, looking at the first one, as I mentioned, we have this kind of crazy system in the United States called the Electoral College. And the way it works is in every state, whoever wins the majority vote in that state gets the electoral votes, with some exceptions. I think Nebraska and Maine actually do proportional representation. So for instance, Donald Trump wins Texas, he gets all 38 of Texas' electoral votes. And the winner is declared by whoever gets to 270 electoral votes first. So as you can see here, Donald Trump, by this poll, had 306 electoral votes, which was plenty to win. But the thing about this is that, because the states are sort of blocked the way they are, you don't need to flip that many states to change this outcome. You flip, 2 or 3 states here, and, suddenly you have 40 electoral votes changing from Trump to Clinton or vice versa. So really, you only have to affect 1% of votes, and this is especially poignant when states have close margins. And we'll talk about some states later that did, but for instance, in New Hampshire, the margin was like 0.3%. So you really only need to flip a few thousand votes there. So challenge one doesn't seem like that big of a blocker for a motivated adversary. How about the fact that the machines aren't connected to the internet? Well, as I previously mentioned, we already know that you can build a virus that spreads between voting machines. And the other thing to note is that when you program a voting machine, typically that is done on a centralized computer like this, just sitting in an office somewhere. And oftentimes that computer is connected to the internet. So if you infect this computer, you can then infect every memory card that's stuck into that computer that then goes into the voting machines and effectively own the whole election. But this is a scenario that I presented to you is actually the way it is. Well, yeah, it actually turns out that it is. In the US, in many states, we have these third-party companies. This one here is Governmental Business Solutions that take it upon themselves to program all of the voting machines in a county or a city or a state. For instance, in the state of Michigan, 3/4 of the voting machines are programmed by one of 2 of these small companies. And by small, I mean they employ 20 people. So, what do you want to do here? Governmental Business Solutions has a great website. It doesn't have a TLS cert, unfortunately, but they have pictures of their warehouse where you could break in and hack into their system. They have emails to all of their employees, so you could launch a phishing attack. So in principle, it wouldn't be that hard to get a virus on the network of one of these companies that would then spread to all of the voting machines, even though the voting machines aren't connected to the internet. But what about this third challenge here? This one seems a little bit more daunting. You can't exactly hack paper, right? And it's not like you're going to convince states to stop using paper if you're an adversary. So what do you do? The idea behind paper is to give you sort of a physical analog that you can fall back on. And sort of a metaphor here is in airplanes, they use physical compasses still in case all of the other gauges and electronics fail. And that's kind of the point of paper ballots as well. Even if the computers mistabulate all the ballots, you can still go do a recount. You can still look at the physical paper ballots and figure out what the voters actually wanted to happen. But the problem with paper is that it's very slow and expensive to tally. You need lots of people. It takes a long time to count every single ballot by hand. But computers are very good at this. The good thing about paper, as I mentioned, is that it's verified by the voter. The voter actually marked this ballot. The voter did not put flip a counter in his memory card, so to speak, or the voter has no way to know that they did. So while paper is slow and expensive to tally, at least it's secure, while memory cards here are fast and cheap to tally, but they aren't verifiable at all. So the goal here is maybe, you can look at some of the paper to indicate that the values on the memory cards were sort of correct. And to give you an idea, as I mentioned, 70% of the United States has some form of paper record of their votes, and this number has actually increased recently. The state of Virginia just got rid of all of its paperless voting machines. So you can see, most places had this paper. So if they used it correctly, your attack would be caught immediately. But unfortunately, no state looks at the paper, or very few states actually look at the paper ballots. We basically have all of this big, expensive paper, we cut down all these trees, we print all these ballots, and then they all go in the garbage as soon as the election is over. So in short, hacking an election is a lot easier than you thought, or than we thought, than people who have been working on this for 20 years thought. First, all you have to do is use pre-election polls to find a few states with close margins. Then you target some of these ballot programming companies in those states and spread a virus to the voting machines. Those viruses then get put on the voting machines and they flip, a small number of votes that is probably not going to be detectable. And then the states throw away the only way that they could detect the attack. Easy, right? So knowing this, this is what we set out to do. We knew that our voting systems were incredibly vulnerable. We knew that these hacking scenarios were plausible, and we had already seen a nation-state adversary active in this election. So what we wanted to do was perform some kind of audit on the 2016 election. But how do we do that? In the US, we basically have 5 weeks after the election before the results get certified and the Electoral College votes. So you really only have a 5-week window if you want to change anything. As I mentioned, the presidential race was extremely close to fine polling. We already saw Russia acting in bad faith in this election, and we've already shown that it's feasible to attack enough machines to affect the outcome. But even under these circumstances, no state was willing to take a second look at their votes and double check that the thing that the machines spit out is actually correct. As I mentioned, we only have these 5 weeks, so we're on a very limited clock. And the two questions that we started with were, is this even possible? Like, can we even confirm an outcome using the evidence that we have in the short span of time that we do? Alex and myself and several other election integrity experts got together and we were trying to, scratching our heads about this. And I should warn you, on the next few slides, there are several pictures of my advisor. Originally, this talk was a joint talk with him, so if you see his face a lot, that's why. So what happens? And there's Alex. About a week after the election, Alex and I were at a conference in Los Angeles and we're flying back to Michigan, and Alex gets this call on a plane, and it's, election integrity people saying, what's the evidence of fraud? How do we pay for recounts? Oh, sorry, I should mention, the call was from the Hillary Clinton campaign. And so the Clinton campaign was trying to figure out, did we really lose this election? Was there evidence of fraud? If there was, or how do we detect it? Can we pay for recounts? The scariest part for the Clinton campaign here is that she had already conceded victory. She had already lost and said, I lost. Donald Trump is the president. So if she had tried to come out and say, hey, I want to do a recount, this is bad. And really, to hammer this point home, in the debates during the election, there was this moment where the moderator asked Donald Trump, if you lose the election, will you accept the results? And Donald Trump didn't provide an answer. He just kind of equivocated and moved on. And Hillary Clinton, in response to this, said that him not directly saying that he would concede is horrifying and a true threat to our democracy. So Hillary Clinton was kind of backed into a corner here. She couldn't very well call for recounts after this exchange and saying anybody who doesn't concede the election is a threat to American democracy. So the Clinton campaign basically had to step by the wayside, and we were feeling a little hopeless here because the only way we were going to get to look at this paper was through a recount, and the only way to get a recount done is using some kind of candidate who was running in the presidential race. So here's about a week later, Alex is sitting in his office and he gets another call, and it's Jill Stein. Jill Stein is the Green Party president in the United States. Green Party candidate in the United States. The Green Party is a small, it's a worldwide party, but it's very small. It only gets, it got 1% of the vote in 2016, but they have a history of championing election integrity. So the fit was pretty good. You know, she was on the ballot in most of the states, especially the states that we cared about, and given her record of election integrity, it seemed that if the Stein campaign could somehow pull together and get a recount done, this was the way to do it. So, unfortunately, in the midst of all this, someone with the Clinton campaign leaked to the press that we were working on trying to figure out, did something go wrong? And unfortunately, they quoted Alex as saying that there was persuasive evidence that the election was hacked. And at this point, we didn't know anything. We just knew that we wanted to look. So this basically ruined a holiday for us, and we had to spend, we stayed up till like 5 in the morning writing a rebuttal here on Medium that I think is still up, and you can go read it if you like. But basically, we were claiming that, we don't know if the election was hacked or not, but the only way we can say yes or no is if we actually looked at the paper ballots. And so at this point, this made international news. It was a big deal. And finally, the Green Party kind of converged on a solution. What they were going to do was fundraise and try to find states where they could pay money and organize lawyers and volunteers to go and recount the ballots. I should mention that Jill Stein here raised $5 million in 2 days. Jill Stein has never raised $5 million in her entire political campaign combined. So this was a very big deal. We had 160,000 donors in the United States wanting our security audit to go forward. So there was clearly a lot of support. So what do? No, we have this money, we have a candidate, we think we can carry on with this. The next question is, what votes are we going to recount? It seems a little difficult to recount the entire country since there were 2 million votes cast, but maybe we could narrow down on a few states. And the states we decided to go with were Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania here. And the reason for that, all 3 were projected to be won by Clinton, and in fact, I believe all 3 had been Democratic states for the last, 40 years or so. Combined, they had 46 electoral votes, which is enough to switch the victory. And all 3, and you'll have to forgive my slide formatting here, this was done on Google Drive, but this is on PowerPoint. All 3 had margins that were less than 0.8%, so they all were very, very close races. In total, decided by fewer than 78,000 votes out of, 100 and some odd million. Plus, Michigan and Wisconsin allow candidates to petition for recounts. In Pennsylvania, unfortunately, it's cut off here, but it's a little more complicated. You have to get 3 citizens in every precinct and to pay a bond, and I'll talk about this in a little bit. So looking at the state of Wisconsin, they have 10 electoral votes. The margin there was 22,000, almost 23,000 votes. Their technology was almost entirely optical scan, so every vote had some form of paper record. And the law states that any candidate can demand a recount if they pay for it. Fortunately, we have a candidate who now has a lot of money to pay for it. The downside to this is that every county in Wisconsin can decide how they recount, whether they actually hire volunteers to recount every single ballot by hand, or whether they just take all of the ballots and put them back through the voting machines that we're trying to figure out if they were hacked or not. The state of Michigan wasn't even closer. It was one of the closest states in 2016, a margin of just shy of 11,000 votes, or 0.23%. Their technology is entirely op-scan, so every vote has a paper record that's actually marked by the voter. And the law in Michigan states that any aggrieved candidate, which it's kind of unclear what that means, but we'll talk about that in a little while, can pay a fee to get a recount, similar to Wisconsin. And in Michigan, also I should mention, this is where the University of Michigan, where I live, is. In the state of Michigan, the State Board of Canvassers, which is sort of the governing body that determines how elections are run, gets to decide how the recount is performed. And fortunately, in Michigan, they decided to do a full hand recount. They weren't going to run any ballots back through machines. And finally, in Pennsylvania, again, another close margin, 0.72%. Unfortunately, in Pennsylvania, they use almost exclusively paperless DRE machines, much like you guys use here in Brazil. Only about 30% of votes were on paper. And the Pennsylvania law for recounts is kind of crazy. It requires 3 citizens from every precinct to pay a bond of like $500 and then swear that they knew there was fraud. This is in every precinct. So in order to recount the entire state of Pennsylvania, we were going to have to find something like 9,000 people to swear that there was election fraud and pay some amount of money to get a recount done. So that seems a little unlikely. And unfortunately, the state does have automatic recount laws where if the margin is below 0.5%, it's automatically recounted statewide. But as you can see, we just barely missed that. We chose these 3 states, but as President Trump and several other people have noted, why didn't we choose others? Well, he is focused on Virginia, New Hampshire, and California, and in fact, there have of late been some other theories about the state of New Hampshire. The state of New Hampshire, the deadline to recount passes 6 days after the election, so there is no time. We didn't even have an idea of what we were doing for 2 weeks after the election. In the state of Virginia, and again, sorry for the formatting, in the state of Virginia, it's illegal to recount unless the margin is below 1%, and Clinton won Virginia by almost 5%, which this is also kind of a crazy law that you can't look at the paper unless the race is closed. And in the state of California, the margin was 30%, so it was pretty unlikely that anything went right. And California is historically voting blue, so there's really no question about the results there. I should also mention there was a recount that was done in parts of Nevada that was fairly inconclusive, that was separate from this, but there were in total 4 states that were recounted. So we have our states, we have our money, we have our candidate, let's get the recount started. So in every state we filed these petitions. Jill Stein filed them on our behalf. Basically, saying, hey, we want to recount, here's the money, go do it. And unfortunately, this ruffled the feathers of the then President-elect Trump, claiming that it was all a scam to fill the pockets of the Green Party, which is not really the point. And as you can see, we're basically halfway through our 5-week period to get this done. So time is starting to run out. I should mention that the actual recounts were really done by the Stein campaign, 10,000 Green Party volunteers, this wonderful law firm, Emery, Shelley, Brinkerhoff, and Abity, who organized lawyers all over the United States to file petitions and oversee the recounts and organize people, as well as several election e-voting experts in the United States and elsewhere who also helped file affidavits and otherwise support the effort. So even though I'm the one giving this talk, I really played a very small part in all of this. What does a recount look like? Well, it looks like this. This is in Washtenaw County in Michigan, which is where I live. In fact, there I am in this picture. And effectively, the way it works when you do a hand count is you have a large stack of ballots. You have 2 poll workers. They pull they pull a stack of about 100 ballots off, and then they count in unison to make sure that they don't mess up or misread the vote, how many votes there are. And while this is going on, you have other people sitting at the table who are volunteers from the party. I was there on behalf of the Green Party. This gentleman here was there on behalf of the Trump campaign, trying to make sure that these 2 ladies here were doing exactly what we were expecting and that there was no ambiguity about the counts. Recounts also look like this. Shortly after we got the recount started, Donald Trump sued in every state that we were trying to recount. Basically as a restraining order claiming that, depending on the law in the states, that this is not legal, you can't do this. So there was a lot of litigation that happened around this outcome. It also looks like this. In response to Trump's litigation and also in response to hesitance by the state of Michigan, people protested. So Lansing is the capital of the state of Michigan, and you can see there's a large protest here who wanted the results checked. We also have this. These are several lovely members of the US press who were there covering everything minute by minute. And as you can see, it wasn't always a fun time. Sometimes they had to cram themselves into small corners. And it looked like this. This is a press junket in Philadelphia. You can see Jill Stein right here in the middle talking to all these reporters. You can see Alex back here. This was right after they had finished arguing in court, I believe. And this made the newspaper and was pretty big news in all of those states. Here's Alex and Jill after hours, trying to sort of enjoy this incredibly stressful experience. So the election, eventually we still hit that 5-week deadline, and the election is decided. Donald Trump is declared the victor, as you probably know by now. So does this mean everything is done? Well, sort of. The recount in Wisconsin actually finished. They recounted every single ballot in Wisconsin, not all of them by hand, but they did recount them all. The state of Michigan, I mentioned earlier there was that aggrieved clause. Well, Donald Trump's lawsuit in the state of Michigan ultimately succeeded by claiming that Jill Stein was not an aggrieved candidate because she only had 1% of the vote. So unfortunately, the recount in Michigan got halted midway, and the recount in Pennsylvania never really got started. So just to recap all of that, and again, sorry for the formatting. In Wisconsin, about half of the ballots were recounted by hand. Even though 51 counties counted, 51 counties counted by hand, 11,883 votes changed. And I want to remind you that the margin of victory in Wisconsin was only like 22,000 votes. So in principle, this is enough to flip the margin. That's nearly 12,000 people whose votes didn't count the first time because the optical scan machines were so bad at recording their votes. However, the total change, or the net change of all of these votes changing, wasn't that much. About 400 votes changed candidates. So really, we can't say that there was evidence of attack. We can say that the machines were kind of crappy, but that's about it. In the Michigan recount, as I mentioned, halted only after 3 days. 10 counties in Michigan finished, 12 started but didn't finish out of 83 total counties. Almost 2.1 million ballots were recounted, though, which is 43%. And again, small net change of about 1,600 votes, and again, no evidence of attack. In Pennsylvania, as far as we can tell, only 1 or 2 counties actually got a recount started. It was only in a few of their precincts, and we've never seen published results from this, so it's not even clear exactly what happened. And our lesson here from Pennsylvania is that it's really hard to do a recount in Pennsylvania. But even though nothing changed in terms of the vote totals, we did discover several interesting things. So in the city of Detroit in Michigan, originally they found that 37% of precincts had too many votes. They had more votes than voters, so that doesn't seem quite right. And then during the recount, they found that half of the precincts in Detroit were ineligible for recounting. And this is because the state of Michigan has this law that says if the edit trail of your ballots, the seals on the bags and the log books that the poll workers have to write everything in, if any of that is missing, broken, tampered, whatever, you can't recount. You just have to suck it up and accept whatever the original result is, which is crazy because if you wanted to actually hack an election, you could hack it and then destroy all the evidence, and it would be illegal in Michigan to figure out what actually happened. So we have all this evidence now, but what are we going to do with it? Ideally, what we want in elections is what's called a statistical risk limiting audit. And basically, you count a very small number of ballots and compare that with the electronic total, and that gives you some idea for how accurate the election was. And depending on the margin and the risk limit you choose, you continue to count until you're satisfied with the results, or you've counted all the ballots, in which case you know what the outcome was. The idea, the key insight here is that it's randomly sampled precincts. Unfortunately, because this recount was not random at all, because in Wisconsin they use different technologies to count, we had no randomness. So unfortunately, what we have is an incomplete, non-random county-level sample, which actually, I really need to update the slide. We now have precinct-level data, but what can we do with this? So just to sort of recap our attack scenarios of what we might be looking for in this evidence, 3 sort of scenarios where an attacker suppresses the vote, where they just prevent people from voting depending on the candidate that they're voting for. They compromise election vendors like GBS, like I was talking about earlier, or they compromise individual voting machines. So, Mallory goes to her local polling place and infects all of those voting machines with a virus, or one voting machine with a virus. So if the randomly selected counties, if recounted counties were counted by hand, then in theory we could detect all of these, right? We'd see either a bunch of missing votes, we'd see a bunch of paper ballots that didn't correspond with electronic records, something of that nature. So that's kind of what we're looking at here. And again, I want to stress that we knew that there was an adversary present in this election. The US government, Congress and the president had already said, they need to investigate this. The intelligence community in the United States had already released a report saying, hey, Russia was trying to elect Donald Trump. So with that in mind, finally, we found out much later that they actually did hack one of the voting vendors, one called VR Systems, and it's suspected that this actually did cause a denial of service in the state of North Carolina, although it didn't seem to affect much broader than that. So, you know, we know that there was hacking. We just are trying to figure out how much there was and did it actually affect the outcome. Walter Mebane and I, he's a political scientist and statistics professor at the University of Michigan, set out with this data set to try and find some way that we can kind of make sense of it. And we published a blog post in the Washington Post Monkey Cage blog that you can go read if you're more interested in it. And we have a paper under submission as well. You know, what is our plan here? So we want to focus on the differences in the signs between the candidates. So, you know, between the original counts and the recounts, you know, votes for candidate A changed, you know, gained votes or lost votes or stayed the same. We want to contrast unlabeled differences with labeled differences. So looking at candidate A lost votes versus Trump lost votes or Clinton lost votes. And we want to see if that labeling actually impacts the change. So what we did was we used multinomial regressions to account for several correlating factors like the use of these vendors, specific voting machines, the candidate that was chosen, and several other things. And the goal here was to try and see, were the labeled and unlabeled differences the same? So if you have a bunch of unlabeled differences that say candidate A and candidate B gained and lost votes, and then you have a bunch of labeled differences that say Clinton and Trump both gained and lost votes, if there was no difference between those two sets, then in theory there was no hacking, or at least the hacking was ineffective. Looking at the results from this, in the state of Wisconsin, we found nothing that significantly correlated. There were no significant differences even between the hand counts and the machine recounts in the state, which is good to know. That implies that the recounting machines weren't also hacked. Overall, we found no evidence that fraud had occurred, or rather that fraud affected the outcome. We can't say for sure whether or not there was malware on the voting machines, but we did notice that one machine saw significantly higher error rates than all of the rest of the voting machines, and it's the Optech 3P Eagle. And in response to this, the state of Wisconsin actually decertified the machine, so it will no longer be used, which is sort of a silver lining to all of this. In the state of Michigan, again, nothing significantly correlated. We didn't find any evidence that fraud affected the outcomes. We did, as I've already mentioned, we saw those significant issues in Detroit, though. And in response to that, the state of Michigan decided to throw away all of its voting machines and buy new ones. So there was some outcome from all of this. But to kind of conclude here, hacking a US presidential election is actually pretty easy. It doesn't appear that it happened in 2016, but that doesn't mean it won't happen again. We're continuing to use these vulnerable voting machines that have these centralized points of attack. States are starting to warm up to this message that, hey, you should really look at the paper. The state of Rhode Island, for instance, just passed a risk-limiting audit law, but in general, most states aren't going to look. Even if you get so far as to actually look at the paper, there are several legal roadblocks in your way. So for instance, the aggrieved clause in the Michigan Constitution or the Pennsylvania sort of mechanism for ensuring a recount are there to stop you from looking at the paper. This is bad. We have seen a nation-state adversary. Several intelligence officials in the United States have said Russia will be back. And there's no reason to think that they elected Trump and they're just going to walk away. So we need to fix this in the United States. We need to harden our voting technology. We need to stop using terrible crypto primitives, OpenSSL 1.1 or something like that, shared cryptographic keys across every machine that's in use. And we need to ensure that attacks are detectable. We need paper records. We need something that we can use to cross-check the machines with. And there are still several states that don't have this, or at least don't have it in full. And finally, we need to actually use the evidence. We need to perform these risk-limiting audits or recounts, depending on the laws. If we do risk-limiting audits, they're much cheaper than full recounts. In states with wide margins, like in Alabama, for instance, in 2016, you would have had to count 7 ballots to confirm the result. That's all we needed them to do, but they can't do it because either they don't have the paper or the law doesn't allow for it. these reforms can be in place in time for 2018, which is our next midterm election, about a year from now. We just have to act on it. So with that, I want to thank you all for listening, and I'm happy to take questions.